on. Okay, everybody, it's 4. We're going to try to get started here on time. I'm glad everyone's having good conversation, but if folks could find their way back for our final session. So welcome everybody to this last session of this TTC, Talk to Catherine, as we heard earlier. I am Karen Bray. I did my PhD here, finished in 2016, and it is a true honor to be home and to come back, especially at this TTC where we are honoring my dear friend and mentor, Catherine Keller. So thank you for pushing through, making it to the end of the day. We're excited for this last panel and the insights and multimedia that will be brought together here. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. They'll introduce themselves. We'll jump in with conversation at the end and then bring you all in. So thanks a lot. John Gill.
Good afternoon, everybody. This mic is hot. Good to see you all. Shout out to the panelists. Shout out to Catherine for making this all possible. If apocalypse were a sound, it would be that. Produced by Lokua. Been fighting all my life, stammering through webs so tremendous my dagger seemed like a small knife. But I practiced in the basement, sharpening it against the plastic mic round rhyme away Chicago nights. Fought villains for blood, spitting and lust wisdom, flipped through books to find which word was the next victim. I threw ninja stars at gas heads and caused explosions with a calm EP held in Maxell. It's listen to whispered moons, flicker over me heavily bodies and leave me a dark room. Tipped over the secret that Dan Brown claimed to show, so my data's the death of God and nobody would know. Please, I can't be possibilities infinite, so I take death penalties for these cats who ain't killing shit. I use poison pistols at point blank, missiles and minions to find I'm the Prince of Peace, so the war is ended, movement 1. I'm John Ivan Gill, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Gustavus Adolphus College, Gilead 7, Tomorrow Kings, greatest hip-hop crew in the galaxy, Echoes of Oratory Music, La Puente, California, greatest crew in the galaxy, Crystal Radio, San Bernardino, California, greatest crew in the galaxy. How y'all feeling? Y'all good? All right, I believe you. Let's take a little journey. If you know the words, feel free to sing. This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end of our elaborate plans, the end of everything that stands, the end. No safety or surprise, the end. I'll never look into your eyes again. I'm gonna just steal the instrumental and talk over it, if that's fine. So apocalypse now and then. Dr. Keller has given us some wonderful things to think about, and I think about them in a very secularist way. So I just released a book called Multi-Racelessness, A Process Philosophy, and I identify the category of race as an apocalypse. So how the hell do I get there? Thank you for asking. So I always had issues with that kind of naming. I remember when the first time my mother told me what those categories were, because she was using them and I was like, well, what do you mean by black? What do you mean by white? What do you mean by this? And when she told me, I could never see the world the same again. And it was a type of apocalypse. And I began to kind of wrestle with that throughout my young years, like, well, why did I feel that way when I heard that category as such? And as I began to think through that, through the history of not only my own genealogies, but the history of philosophy from west to east and north to south, through theological thought, through post-structuralism, through hip hop, I came to the realization that the category of race itself is traumatic. So here's what I say about that in the text. Succinctly, I assert that race, the colonial event of reducing the human to categories separate pre-colonial methods of identification, is a traumatic psychological experience perpetuated and perpetually rehashed by dominant systems and those of us willingly and unwillingly governed by them. When someone is referred to and or accepts that they are any racial or race-related category, such as, but not limited to, black, white, Latinx, indigenous, Native American, African American, and Asian, I assert that they partake in the mirror, repeating the traumatic experience from which the categories emerge and confusing it as themselves. Whitehead calls that the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You know it. Chime along. The text aims to establish on this novel proposition that the category of race itself, as opposed to being an authentic identity in some significant sense, standing outside of the oppressive confluences of social forces chaotically converging into the category, is like a notion of panentheism where God is the world, but is also beyond the world. So how do I get here? What does it mean to kind of think through the categories as traumatic? Sometimes we don't think about race and trauma as synonymous, but what if we did? The contradictions in the usage of the category. If the definition white refers to those who have ancestry in the continent now referred to as Europe, then I should be white. But I never get to use the category as such. So the category is contradictory in terms, and it is also inherently hierarchical. So can I have a category of race without hierarchy? I also say, through the colonial projects starting in the late 15th century and changing the landscape of the globe, The trauma of race is not a pre-existing unity of consciousness upon which trauma is inflicted. Rather, race happened to previously raceless individuals and is stripping of some humans of personhood and elevating others above personhood. So in this process framework, as I begin to come to terms with how the category phenomenologically impressed itself upon me, I argue that, well, the category of whiteness is non-human, above humanity. Every other category is below humanity, and humanity is somewhere in between those two. So the axiom of this text is the racialized body is the traumatized body. Here, I want to attempt to think of racial and race-related categories as slavery, as theft of land, as forceful renaming of people, arbitrary demarcation separating those who may have previously perceived no separation at all, various types of discrimination from redlining to lack of access to necessities and much more. Such a shift allows for not only a more critical analysis and deconstruction of racial and race-related categories, if the assertion of race as trauma, or what I would hereinafter refer to as race/trauma, thank you, Catherine, is plausible, it provides a solid reason for the abolishing of race not seen in more utopian or differently grounded philosophies. Further, if race is traumatic, then perhaps it could be reconceived as a problem that needs to be excavated by the psychoanalytic therapist, the so-called self, the community, and so on. It is not common to seriously consider race as the same or similar to any other traumatic experience, and this text aims to take our imaginations there. So will you imagine with me? So the thesis, the category of race for me is by nature racist. Mic drop, I'm done. No, I'm not done. So in this understanding of race for me as an apocalyptic event that perpetuates itself and starts from the Middle Passage on, Theodore Walker, in his book, Mothership Connections, a neoclassical synthesis of metaphysics and black theology. I think that's the right, what he says. If not, Google it. But what I do know he says is that he argues, riffing off of Charles Long, that modernity begins with the Middle Passage. It begins with the commodification of humans. It begins with the theft of land. It begins with renaming. And what do we do with that apocalypse? Which, if the categories are perpetually used, are we continuing the apocalypse? And what might it mean to step outside of that logic? And how do I understand that to have happened for me? And I'm summarizing a lot because I can't be up here for 15 hours. So in these ruminations around race and always having an issue with the categories themselves, not nationality, not genealogy, but the category of race itself, I, as a young person, I'm still kind of young, but not really, I began to engage in what is referred to as underground hip hop, which I call in my work an aesthetic shrine religious organism which pays homage to the elements of the culture. Hip hop is not just rap. Hip hop is graffiti, it's breakdancing, it's DJing, it's MCing. Underground hip hop is a manifestation of all of those things, knowledge and understanding in the present. So not reliving the past, but building off of the past. And I was really struck, and maybe I didn't even know when it happened, the way identity is negotiated in underground hip hop. And when I wrote my first monograph, which actually is my dissertation, which Catherine was very influential in, Underground Rap is Religion, which is for sale, so I got copies. Don't leave without one. There's a narrative that has me coming to terms with a post-apocalyptic yet apocalyptic world in the underground. And it is as follows, if I can find a page. Oh, there it is. It was almost 20 years ago. That space was amazing. I understood it before, but it really became crystally unclear that day at Northeastern University. My friend Rusty parked the car, and we raced out as the sounds of kicks and snares and bass contrasted in the speakers we were heard in the distance. They lured us. Where the hell is it coming from? We kept walking down the empty halls of the university and seemed to travel farther from the sonic utopia each step. Damn, what the fuck? We tossed and turned down this floor and that floor until finally we hit it. There was only 2,200 feet between us and the auditorium where life was born again. I ran to the door, drunk in the sounds of what could be notes and staccato vocals smashed on top of each other. My heart beat to overloading capacity as I opened the door. There I was home, but I'd never been there like this before. The room was packed. In its middle were two circles of physical artists spinning on the floor as the rhythms inspired them to create holograms for us all to walk through. In the corner, by the stage, were pen players, scribbling hard to decipher symbols on blank white sheets. It looked like the paradise you might see if you understood what the colored hieroglyphs outside of your train really were not. On the stage was a humanoid, at least they may have been, turning records into tilt-a-whirls, defying centrifugal force in ways that sounded like music. All around the room were collections of humans talking on beat off the top of their heads. Someone told me they were ciphering or freestyling. I started doing it too. What was it? It was hip hop. It was the next universe, a world within a world. It is the epitome of authenticity / the maintenance of multiplicity. We were all one, yet many. There was no race there. We took spaceships beyond that. I was saved. How dare I call up my mom's Jesus? This is what the Tunnel Rats meant when they sang the chorus. I'm talking about a place called hip hop. Whatever happened to that place called hip hop? I never seen you in that place called hip hop. So the lies that you speak need to stop. I went there and never left. So imagining beyond the categories of race that hip hop helped me to see, along with my genealogy, a post-apocalyptic vision of a world that was still counter-apocalyptic in holding in tension that which came before, yet imagining beyond it, I begin to think, well, this of course has more to do with than just hip hop. So how might one move away from the cataclysm that is racial categories if the categories I've just mentioned are fraught with this type of hierarchy, oppression? How might we move beyond them? Thank you for asking. I appreciate that. So in an appeal to Whiteheadian process philosophy, also the philosophies of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras. My dad's side of the family is from Belize and Honduras. The philosophies of Noble Drew Ali, who is the founder of what is referred to as the Moorish Science Temple of America, precursor to the Nation of Islam. There are four things that came to mind. In Whiteheadian philosophy, we know that creativity is the ultimate force. God, in many ways, is subsumed to creativity. I start with that. Well, the human is by nature creative. And that creation defies the borders. I do a lot of talk around borders in my work. What is a border? What can be understood to be distinctions between this and that? Creativity begins with the notion in Whitehead that, well, the many are always one, the many are becoming one. How might that be a basis to understand our humanities and process? Second, what I refer to as kind of merging the work of Brian Masumi and Whitehead, useful lived abstraction. Well, now that we understand that, if we buy this, that the categories of race are inherently fraught, what symbols do we use to navigate beyond it? So what I refer to as useful lived abstractions are snapshots. Snapshots such as genealogy, culture, nationality. And the way I define those terms in the text, nationality is simply the act or the belonging to a nation legally. And nationality, for me, is the legal protection for culture. Things that we have in terms of practices, histories, foods, etc. And genealogy. Genealogy is what I refer to, or what Noble Drew Ali refers to as self-study. How much has the category of race stopped us from studying ourselves and asking us, I'm more than so-called, or not Latinx, not African, not Caribbean, not any of these categories that we can trace to colonial means. How might I understand myself beyond that? Genealogy. To go a bit further, silence is also noise. I kind of do that on purpose sometimes not. So to go further in this, so genealogy is very important for me in this talk. First of all, the family tree, where one comes from, engaging the histories. What's there that we haven't talked about? Deconstruction. Well, after I've seen what's there, how might I reimagine what I've been told about it? And the next step is creativity. What do I do with what I've discovered? So for example, I have a song where I did this. The song is called Unspoken, where riffing off of the work of Noble Drew Ali and my grandfather's side of the family, I took a peek and said, are the categories of race I've been prescribed to fit under, do they fit with what I know about who I am and who I'm becoming? Produced by Boricua Sandy. We have a crew called Virgo Twins. He was clear as day. Sitting on a throne, he passed me one and then addressed me as bae. Shimmering turban converts sunlight to lessons. Radiator rays answer questions telekinetic. I think to myself, is this who I think it is, or is it all in my mind? Cause he died in 1929. And maybe he returned for said lost sheep he could find. And to change you from black to human, press rewind. I dug up the long gold and the mark where the treasure is. Dug up the red earth and there emerged but the lesser his. Papers prior reassigning outlining lost nation. And affairs perpetrated by Masons amazing. Like the turn the tide. Graduation, the chess matches over the psyches of misplaced Asians. He shared this and had to win any court cases. And after he left me the keys, he left me and left no traces. Ain't that something? I must be tripping though. Ain't that something? Thanks, Breeze Brewing. Unspoken, the thoughts that I'm telescoping, I hold in. Is this vision a dear, really living, or just a notion, emotion? Opened in chambers that I was closed in. Incidentally summoned ancestors by the ocean. Unspoken, the thoughts that I'm telescoping, I hold in. Is this vision a dear, really living, or just a notion, emotion? Opened in chambers that I was closed in. This room blowing through my window was irritating. It's fucking with me while I'm in Zen meditating. I'm trying to zone out, turn wild mind and it grows. That wasn't Augusta, was Yvonne taking O's. The multi-dimensional, super-missional tourist. You the brother that left mi abuela in Honduras. That brother I'm named after, named to your brain matter. Known from banding with your bars where all your homies gather set up. I asked him questions about our blood, where we came from. He said, from the ground upon which you kneel, like you were made, son. Right brain, get it? Made, son. On to next thing. Don't be like me, sticking your poco mucho de punta ritmo. Spend the time with your fam a bit more, kiss your wife slow, and read as much as you lust. That part I did right. Invest for assets, open canals for birthright passage. We pass up Alibart Street, now we suffer damage. Yes, your father have a hard head, and that's mi culpa. Don't take my life as a blueprint. I roll too many models, I nod and see him vanish as fast as he come to me. Watching the sunset with palomitas like a movie, unspoken. And I'll end this reflection with some words from Catherine Keller that have really inspired me. I mean, there's so many, I couldn't put them all in here, but just riffing off of one of my favorite parts of Apocalypse Now and Then. Counter-apocalypse dis/closes. It would avoid the closure of the world signified by a straightforward apocalypse, and it would avoid the closure of the text signified by an anti-apocalypse. The slash, empathizing with the gashes in history open in the buddy name of the end, shout out to Jim Morrison and the Doors, is placed in mimicry of the stylus with which John was commanded by the Spirit to write. One more, because Catherine Keller's a dope-ass MC. If then, counter-apocalypse echoes and parodies apocalypse in order to disarm its polarities, it also savors its intensities, its drives for justice, its courage in the face of impossible odds and losses. Not unlike the clearing of the woods of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, where broken bodies get spirited and dance. One more. A counter-apocalyptic reading, in other words, has affinities with both anti-apocalyptic and neo-apocalyptic versions. But in perhaps perverse parody of fundamentalism, whose retro-apocalypse it must work to not counter-demonize, it would linger with the link between past and present history. So thank you, Catherine. And I think of multi-racelessness as a type of counter-apocalypse for me. If race as a category has been traumatic and has been repeated through the mirrors of colonization and liberation, us saying things like stop Asian hate, Black Lives Matter, etc., brown power, etc., if the trauma is reproduced through that terminology and through that way of thinking and through that way of being, multi-racelessness might possibly be the difference between responsible and irresponsible post-race. This is certainly a post-race philosophy. The irresponsible side, we'll start with the bullshit first. The irresponsible side would say, if I change the names, I change the condition. That is the antithesis of what multi-racelessness is, which is the acknowledging of the present and the past while saying the future is not determined. And shout out to one of my professors, Vito Wessela, rest in peace, who talked about this notion in Hegel, which is this closed system of eschatology, versus Derrida. Difference is always negating and decaying and giving the possibility for recreation. So responsible post-race is where I leave us in a post-apocalyptic world. Thank you.
John, you're a hard act to follow. I was just thinking at the very beginning there, I was like, man, I do not envy the Fordham press people for trying to figure out how to publish John's paper. So mine's a little more straightforward than that. And I figured that most of y'all probably don't know very much about me, and so to understand or put in context my paper, I had submitted a bio, and so I'm going to read that. So please pretend as if I were Rob, reading this bio. The Reverend Dr. Jim Ball is publisher and content creator of ClimateHopeTogether.com. For 20 years, he was in senior leadership at the Evangelical Environmental Network, including 10 years as president. He was the founder and chair of both Evangelicals for Biden and Evangelicals for Harris. He was the architect of the What Would Jesus Drive educational campaign and key organizer and national spokesperson for the Evangelical Climate Initiative. He has been featured in the New York Times and Vanity Fair, recognized by Time magazine as one of its climate change innovators, and by Rolling Stone as one of their climate warriors and heroes. He has testified on Capitol Hill and appeared on ABC's Good Morning America, Fox, CNN, and NPR. He is the author of Global Warming and the Risen Lord, Christian Discipleship and Climate Change. So that's just a little bit about me to give you a little bit of context for my talk. I embrace the mic. All right, well, I'm going to be embracing it quite a bit in a little bit here. So I know there's another title up there, but really the working title that I had from the beginning and the one I still like the best is Touched by Apocalyptic. So that's the title of my talk, Touched by Apocalyptic. Let me preface my remarks by saying that I'm here for Catherine. During my time at Drew in the 90s, I was a bit like an orphan academically in Drew's ecosystem, a vagrant bird. I didn't fit into the main grad school camps of the time. I was a white, male evangelical focused on the environment, for which there was no coursework. I was an orphan and a stranger, a Lake Wobegon type of student. Catherine took me in and served on my dissertation committee. She didn't have to. That tells you a lot about her. I'm still grateful. I'll always be grateful. So thank you, Catherine. I am not an academic scholar. I'm a practitioner, a praxis do-thinker and think-doer. So rather than interacting with a body of scholarship, I will be offering personal reflections on how I've been touched by apocalyptic. As an evangelical, I want to share with you my apocalyptic testimony, so to speak. I want to unveil the secret behind my 30 years of climate activism. When I was about 14 years old, I remember seeing at the checkout line at Safeway in Richardson, Texas, a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, right next to a book of crossword puzzles in the National Enquirer. Puzzles and sensationalism sounds apocalyptic to me. So maybe it was in good company. Never read it until I met Catherine Keller. Before meeting Catherine, I was too snooty to stoop to apocalyptic pulp fiction. Figured I'd leave that to Quentin Tarantino. Growing up in the 70s, pre-moral majority, I went to a middle-class, Main Street kind of Southern Baptist church. No dispensationalism, no rapture stuff. I can't remember talking about the book of Daniel, except for Daniel himself as an exemplar of trusting God. After I had my calling experience at 19, which was a sudden, unexpected unveiling, I went to Baylor and majored in psychology. Then it was on to Southern Seminary in Louisville to get my MDiv. This was in the mid-'80s, before the fundamentalist takeover, and Southern was considered the best of the SBC seminaries academically. While at Southern, I became involved in a Baptist peacemaker group at Crescent Hill Baptist Church, and Professor Glenn Stassen, a member of the group and a former student of Reinhold Niebuhr, became my mentor. Through the group, I became a foot soldier in the nuclear freeze campaign. When you're the kind of evangelical I am, a peace and justice guy who wants to be engaged in serious things and be taken seriously, and a guy named Hal Lindsey, who also can be considered an evangelical, publishes a book like The Late Great Planet Earth, you want to put as much distance as you can between you. He and others like him are part of the broader evangelical family, but you wish they would just stay out of sight because you don't want to be embarrassed by them. And so I was touched by the Pulp Fiction kind of apocalyptic in a way that had me running in the opposite direction. I didn't know it. I didn't want to know it. As my career of climate activism attests, as my current Substack, Climate Hope Together, proclaims in every post, I am a transformationalist. Not because I read H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture in Southern Seminary in the mid-'80s as part of Glenn's class. I am a transformationalist because I am an evangelical pietist whose church life was shaped by revivalism with an altar call every Sunday and a chance to change your life forever. As such, I believe in human freedom. I believe every moment is a kairos moment, an opportunity to make a decision for God. I believe God loves everyone, and that's why God wants to have a relationship with me, a sinner. God's love came to town in the form of his Son, Jesus, who pitched his tent among us. I believe Jesus died for everyone, and thus each person has inestimable value. God's love for everyone and everything is why from the very beginning I saw the injustice of climate change, that the poor, folks God loves and Jesus died for, would be hit the hardest by something they didn't cause. That's why I made climate change my life's work. I am an evangelical pietist who grew up with altar calls asking over and over, do you know Jesus? Have you accepted Jesus as your personal Savior? Have you asked Jesus into your heart? Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart. Will you let him in? And the hymn of commitment says to you, softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling for you and for me. See at the portals, he's waiting and watching, watching for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, oh sinner, come home. In 1974, when I was 12, I accepted the soft and tender call of Jesus to come home. I asked Jesus to come into my heart as my personal Savior and Lord. My piety is primarily a Jesus piety. It's still the case that I sincerely want all of us to know Jesus. But how can you know who this Jesus is? Who God is? My traditions answer. You read the Bible, God's Word. You find the living God and Jesus in the Bible. It is your guide for faith and life. For an evangelical Jesus pietist like myself, the Bible is not a cookbook or a secret code book. Neither is it a dead letter or an archaeological tell. It's how I can know God personally, relationally, how I can find the living God, the I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob God, how I can know Jesus and be intimate with Jesus because I've invited him into my heart. The Bible is like a diary telling the story of God's love for his creation, for all of us, the secrets of God's heart, unveiled and available for all to see. And the supreme unveiling is in the form of a person, Jesus, who in turn introduces us to his Abba. The Bible is the medium through which Jesus is unveiled to us, relational knowing. More than that, reading or hearing the Bible is a sacrament where we literally encounter the real presence of the triune communion. If I search for God with all of my heart, Abba, Jesus, the Spirit, will be unveiled in the act of reading and hearing the Bible, a relational unveiling, a relational apocalypse. What have I found? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. For Abba so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God is love. The living God, the I am God, Abba, is the love God who is giving us hearts of flesh to replace our hearts of stone. The Great Commandments, the key to what life is all about, says it's about loving the living God and others. Abba, the living God, has written this on our hearts of flesh. In short, the Bible is a love story, but one with an apocalyptic aura. The kingdom of God, Abba's place, is what this Jesus I invited into my heart talked about the most. But what is it? Is it a secret only the chosen few can know? Turns out Jesus is the worst secret keeper ever because he told us the secret in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The kingdom is heaven, Abba's place, unveiled on earth. The kingdom is where the living God's will is done, where the great commandments, loving Abba with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving our neighbors as ourselves, loving the foreigner, loving our enemies, comes to fruition. And when it does, the inbreaking, the unveiling of the kingdom, Abba's love place, is happening. The kingdom, look, there it is. The unveiling of Abba's love, Jesus' love, the Spirit's love, poured out in our hearts, spilling out all around us. Where? Where love rules. It is where Alex Preddy protects his neighbors with a whistle and his body. But isn't that what apocalyptic is? Abba, the love God, unveiled, breaking into this present age? The love God suddenly revealed, a new revelation? Isn't the kingdom apocalyptic? Isn't Jesus, the Son of Man, apocalyptic? The glorious divine presence, the Shekinah, Yahweh, the I am, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob God, suddenly appearing in the life of Israel once again after centuries of absence, but hidden in the human flesh of a Palestinian peasant baby? God present in the young man Jesus for those with eyes to see. God and Jesus defeating the forces of evil during his ministry, who recognize who he is while others don't. The Son of God, Abba's Son, transfigured and unveiled to Jesus' most intimate disciples, Peter, James, and John, who see Elijah and hear the voice of Abba in the divine cloud. And even then their eyes are veiled until the time for their unveiling. Jesus as the embodiment of the living God's love, defeating the forces of sin and death and evil by his own death on a cross, power perfected in weakness. Hasn't Jesus suddenly rescued us when the time was right from our sinful selves, something no power on earth could do, and pulled us out of the depths of the depraved world, only to send us hurling right back, but with him in our hearts? Isn't Jesus' resurrection apocalyptic? The sudden, surprising, embodied inbreaking of the age to come in this present age, on this earth that waits on tippy toes for the revealing, the unveiling of this child of God, for all the children of the living God, for all of Abba's children. Isn't this the world turned upside down? Isn't the New Testament apocalyptic from beginning to end? Where the final book, the book of Revelation, the book of apocalypsis, heaven comes down to earth, where Abba, the living God's will is done, where love reigns, where the earth and human existence are not destroyed, but transformed into a new heaven and a new earth, where God is making all things new, where Abba dwells with humanity and his creation, created very good from the very beginning, both healed to be what God always wanted us to be, where no one is left behind, where there is no end of the world, yet everything is transformed by love. This is a strange sort of Abba apocalyptic, an upside down, soft and tender apocalyptic. Not at all what Hollywood would produce. Not at all what many popular books of the late great planet Earth genre would recognize. Not what the word has come to me in common parlance. All that yelling gets you a little thirsty. And so it turns out, I've been touched by the living God's apocalyptic all along. I'm a pietistic, Abba apocalyptic transformationalist because Jesus is my Savior and my Lord. And his grace empowers me to do Abba's will, to let love reign in me, to embody the inbreaking, the unveiling of the kingdom, Abba's place, to be an apocalypse of love in our finite, sinful reality where evil still stalks our steps. As a walking contradiction to the world, an evangelical pietist climate justice guy, I challenge the dark, powerful injustice of climate change because I am equally yoked with Jesus and his love is being unveiled in my heart. However much I am able to let it be so every second of every day, to have our relationship be what it was always meant to be, a deep, loving communion, a struggle Jesus helps me with until I draw my final breath. And in that struggle, I try to let Jesus' love be unveiled through me, because by its very nature, such love cannot be hoarded, it must be expressed. Being an apocalyptic transformationalist, have I read the signs of the times? The climate ones, certainly. Do I have anything to prophesy? Perhaps disappointingly, I have no fantastical creatures to interpret, no secret codes to share with you. But I do have this, a dream of mine to interpret. I believe the climate movement will become the greatest and most long-lasting social change movement in the history of the world, if all who are called will accept this call to serve, to choose life, so that we and our descendants will live. And as we overcome climate change together, we will create a just and prosperous sustainability that enhances well-being for everyone and everything. We will live in and live out the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." So the secret of my 30 years of climate activism is not much of a secret after all. Jesus in my heart, forever giving me every moment of every day a love I cannot keep. Manna in the desert to live in this already not yet world. The bread of life to sustain me in choosing life, because I've been raised to walk in newness of life for the sake of creating a better life together. Jesus in my heart to realize Abba's dream for us, what we were made for from the very beginning, a deep, loving communion with the triune God, where together we create God's reality in which everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree, and none make them afraid, where, having wept with those who have wept, we wipe away every tear, and together are surprised by the apocalypse of joy. Let me close with this. As an evangelical pietist, an evangelical Jesus pietist, I issue you an invitation. It's altar call time. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling. Time to know Jesus. Time to take Jesus into your heart. Time to be equally yoked with Jesus and face life's challenges together. Time to unveil the real presence of Jesus in you to the world. Time to embody the embraking of the apocalypse of love. Time to transform the world. Look, behold, love is here. Love unveiled. Love breaking in. It's right here.
Well, the last paper on last things has come. My name is John Thatamanil, known to most of you here. I teach just a little bit north at Union Theological Seminary, work on comparative theology mostly, so writing about apocalypse and ecology is relatively new to me. And if anyone had said that I would be on a hip-hop panel and two of the three panelists would have sung, but not me, I would not believe it, and yet here we are. So let me just dive in so we can talk. And man, is my paper different than the almost optimistic, hopeful note just sounded. In two different ways, I would think. From the first, an apocalyptic note has hovered over the very formation of Christian eco-theology as a field. Recall the title of one of the first English language books in the field, penned by Catherine Keller's Dr. Father, Is It Too Late? Published in 72, I believe. The title demonstrates the farsightedness that these many decades later ought to strike readers as unnerving in its capacity to anticipate what has since unfolded. Writing 50 years later in his preface to the latest edition of the book, Cobb soberly speaks of failure. I think that, this is a quote, I think that 50 years ago, if we Christians had repented and if society as a whole had adopted a different view of the world we have been given, major crises such as the plague we now suffer could have been avoided. But those of us who proclaimed that in the language of that time a sustainable society was at hand have failed, just as Jesus did. The world can no longer escape global crises, terrible suffering, and the immense loss of life. Numerous species have already been forever lost. Farmland has been irretrievably turned into desert, and our best agricultural land has been saturated with poison. The corals are growing fast. The ocean is already acidified. The global temperature is rising. It is hard to see how the threat of nuclear war can be eradicated. Probably the planet will never again be as hospitable to human habitation as it was a half a century ago. Close quote. The double failure, in Cobb's words, is worth noting. Jesus' failure to call Jerusalem to a nonviolent alternative to self-destructive armed insurrection against Rome, and Cobb's own failure to call North American Christians to ecological civilization. So perhaps all Christian theology is crafted in the wake of failure. Of course, Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God flickers forward despite Jerusalem's ancient downfall. And Cobb also hopes and holds on to modest hopes for a chastened but not yet final future. And what are the hopes? What are those hopes? That local communities can come to know how to love not just other humans, but other creatures. And an expanded conception of what constitutes Christian love, necessary if at least some of us are to survive. And here it is necessary again to quote Cobb at length, and please take note of his sobering use of the conditional. However, it is still possible that thousands of local communities can become self-sufficient in essentials. They may develop societies in which there is a strong sense of responsibility for all rather than the dominance of competition for resources. In short, societies in which people love each other and other creatures with which they may, I think I got that wrong, in which they may live to survive. Just as the positive result of Jesus' message was the survival and development of loving communities, so following him today includes building local communities based on mutual love. They will not save the world from appalling disasters, but it is possible that many of them may survive the catastrophes we now expect. Close quote. May. A future conditional for a conditional future that hinges on a knife edge of transformed possibility. No wonder then that another kind of title has now begun to appear, one that not only removes the question mark from Cobb's early offering, but now embraces another task, one that must be resolutely reckoned with if Cobb's question is no longer open, but now grimly resolved. If indeed it is now largely too late, then surely the task at hand for theologians, pastors, and their communities is nothing less than planetary hospice for a passing species. The title of this paper, cheery, I know. Hence, the new kind of title in books such as Roy Scranton's Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, or the co-authored work by Canadian poet-philosophers Robert Bringhurst and Jan Zwicky, Learning to Die, Wisdom in the Age of Climate Crisis. But who or what precisely is it that is already dying? A way of life? Our own species and many others, or perhaps both? The nature of planetary hospice would depend on how we answer these questions. A closely related question also lingers. How do secular scientific doomsayers differ materially from far-right apocalyptic doomsayers? What different ethical obligations follow from those who herald the end, whether that ending comes to us by way of Christ's imminent return or a scientifically grounded proclamation of eco-apocalypse? Few Christian theologians have tended to these questions with greater care than Catherine Keller. Keller's extensive and generative corpus will hold its own with that of any theologian, ancient or modern. Still, the question that haunts all our work, Keller's included, is whether and for how long readers will remain. I have said before and will say again that many worlds have already ended, but never before the entire world. It is that latter possibility that now should trouble us. Keller's work is altogether mindful of the gathering doom. She knows too much to offer Christian communities false consolation. But like her doctor father, her goal is not to cry doom or to speak of foreclosed futures, but instead to call out for disclosure. There may yet be time for us to come back from the brink. No, not for all of us, and certainly not for a restoration of all things. Difficult sentence to write for someone who loves notions of apocalypsis. There are too many species already gone, glaciers retreating at anything but a glacial pace, and much of our topsoil despoiled beyond repair. No purveyor of Pollyannish possibilities, but real and fragile possibilities still offered to us by a divine that is always offering the best of what can still, even now, be realized. So what then of these discourses of death? Must they be adamantly refused? Do they offer a kind of false affective consolation afforded by certainty rather than by open-ended unknowing? Rather than endure an agonizingly open future, there is at least the consolation offered by a clear diagnosis. At least now I know what to feel and what work remains for me to do. That was certainly my own experience and my father's as I sat beside his bedside almost exactly this time last year. The terminal diagnosis was in. We had weeks, perhaps days, not months. No further interventions were possible, no miracle cures. All that remained to do was to lovingly take our leave of each other. His work was to leave, and mine was to accompany him as he made his exit. Is that the labor that remains for the species? Are we the terminal patient that must leave well, so that at least some of our plant and animal kin stand a fighting chance? Discourses in hospital chaplaincy tend to focus on the work of dying well or a good death. There is also, on the medical front, the work of pain management as an essential component of palliative care for those in the end stage of life, when cure is no longer possible. To evoke the language of hospice is to inquire about what it means to die well at the level of the species, if indeed species death is now regarded as inevitable. But this task changes radically if what must and will die is not our species, but instead a mode of life rooted in carbon-fueled capitalism. In both cases, pain management and grief work will be necessary. The lingering question is one of scale, not an individual death, but death on a far greater scale. If it is we who are dying, then the labor before us is to show ourselves out the door with grace. We leave, even go down singing, so that we do not take out all our kindred species in a frenzy of graceless and all-consuming self-destruction. But in the latter case, we must instead herald and even accelerate not the death of our species, but rather the death of our carbon-fueled capitalism, which would be a contemporary enactment of the death of death, a cross upon which our death-dealing practices are crucified in the fragile hope of a coming resurrection, if not for all, then at least for some. So then, which death is upon us? The death of Homo sapiens or carbon capitalism? Can we know? One thing we can be sure of, if carbon capitalism does not die, we surely will, and perhaps by the billions. It follows then, if we must wager on the latter, if there is to be any hope that the former fate can be attenuated, even if it is no longer possible to stop mass death. To speak of death and dying well, on either of these two accounts of what it might mean to die, is to sound alarm bells. And not all respond with grace, restraint, and wisdom in a time of endings. Many refuse to reckon with where we are now and insist on living as though climate scientists have not been signaling the possibility of a terminal diagnosis. But far worse is the frenzy of those who have received a terminal diagnosis, believed the diagnosis, but elected instead to insist on escapist fantasies to shield themselves alone from what is coming for the rest of humanity and the planet itself. Consider the capitalist elite about whom Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor wrote last year in The Guardian. They warn us about a certain class, now emboldened by the Trump administration, that seeks to desire without constraints, limits, or obligations. To escape any belonging to the rest of us, they have resolved to leave any national commons. Care for the planetary commons does not remotely enter into the ambit of their imaginations. Klein and Taylor, in their brilliant and troubling essay, which I'm glad to know will become a book to be released in September, warn us of how the financial elite scheme to form corporate city-states, whether on sea or land, in which they gather themselves not into just gated communities, but gated fiefdoms, exempt from taxation and democratic nation-state norms, with nothing owed to the rest of humanity, never mind other species. What does this end times fascist vision look like? Klein and Taylor write, and I quote, "Inspired by a warped reading of the political philosopher Albert Hirschman, figures including Goff, Thiel, and the investor and writer, an Indian name which sad to pronounce here, Balaji Srinivasan, have been championing what they call exit. The principle that those with the means have the right to walk away from the obligations of citizenship, especially taxes and burdensome regulation, retooling and rebranding the old ambitions and privileges of empires. They dream of splintering governments and carving up the world into hyper-capitalist, democracy-free havens under the sole control of supremely wealthy, protected private mercenaries serviced by AI robots and financed by cryptocurrencies." Close quote. If this isn't an apocalyptic end times vision, I don't know what is. No need to decamp to Mars if you can have freedom cities here on Earth, sovereign territories ruled over by billionaire god kings. What's most craven about this aspiration is that, and I quote them again, the startup country contingent clearly foresee a future marked by shocks, scarcity, and collapse. Their high-tech private domains are essentially fortressed escape pods, designed for the select few to take advantage of every possible luxury and opportunity for human optimization, giving them and their children an edge in an increasingly barbarous future. To put it bluntly, the most powerful people in the world are preparing for the end of the world, an end they themselves are frenetically accelerating. Close quote. No denialism here whatsoever. This startup country contingent knows what is coming. They have heard the alarm bells. Species death, our own and that of countless others, makes no difference to this lot. They have shrewdly recognized the doom that is upon us, the doom that they themselves are now actively bringing about, even as they alone seek to escape its ravages. Never mind that others will die, so long as they and their children manage to survive in high-tech fortified luxury. So why speak of these conscienceless capitalists? Their materialist survivalism, an uncanny mirror to fundamentalist rapture-based escapism, as Klein and Taylor perceptively recognize, gives us the most peculiar of double gifts. A funhouse mirror in which we can see, one, what is already becoming of us under a politics funded by this predator billionaire class. Two, the exact inverse of what we must instead become together if we are to die well and stand a chance of survival and perhaps even of flourishing. Whether they get their freedom cities or not which is not hardly, the double negations here doesn't quite work. Whether they get their freedom cities or not is hardly immaterial. They must be stopped. But even as we try to mobilize a counter-politics of resistance, they present us with a precise and perverse incarnation of what it looks like to refuse to die well on either account of death, sketched above. Theirs is an astonishing clarity granted us in their survivalist obscenity, in their politics of exception, in their refusal of even the thinnest sense of co-belonging with the rest of the planet, human and non-human, in their resolute anthropocentrism, in their economies of unfettered grief. They give us the exact depiction of what we dare not become in this time of last chances. It's a curious, curious gift they give us. Any chance of mitigating the consequences of unfettered climate catastrophe will require us to adopt the exact inverse of just these choices. Against a politics of exception, we need, one, a more robust democratic politics than any we have yet imagined, one that grants a voice not just to silenced humans, but also to our species kin who cannot speak for themselves, a democracy of all creatures. Already a notion sounded in Lynn White's essay. It's astonishing that it's already there. That requires, at the very least, a deepening sense of co-belonging and entanglement with all sentient beings, to mobilize Buddhist vocabulary. Two, but even that Buddhist vocabulary may be limited as it grants insufficient attention to the inorganic, itself the basis for all life. Our co-belonging must either become planetary or remain insufficient. A radical counter to anthropocentrism may require from us not just a deep attention to other living beings, but even a theology of the inorganic, without which there is no possibility of organic life whatsoever. Three, but to undergird all of these possibilities, we stand in desperate need of a robust affective counter to all-consuming greed that these elites seek to serve but can never appease. And here, Buddhists have for millennia insisted that the only effective counter to egoistic craving is indeed a deep compassion for all beings. All-inclusive karuna, compassion, which never omits oneself from its ambit, is the only effective antidote for egoistic greed. I'm deeply moved by evangelical piety of my childhood, and I kind of softly sang along, but I'll sing a paean to the Bodhisattva as well. I think it's all hands on deck. So, that reminds me, right? It's, maybe I will. You all know the Bodhisattva vow by the Beastie Boys? As I awake to the awakening mind, I praise the Buddhas as they shine. What else does? I forgot it. I used to know it by heart. To follow their task, I make my full-time task. Follow their path, I make my full-time task, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's really good. A deep translation by the Beastie Boys of Shantideva's Bodhisattva vow. It's precise and Buddhologically sophisticated. I wish that I recalled it more fully and could have joined John there. The escapist politics of the fortress served by these elites demonstrates with startling clarity that knowing alone is never enough. These elites accept the relevant scientific findings. Their AI-fueled techno-fever dreams are too indebted to and entangled with contemporary science to simply dismiss what the climate scientists have been telling us. While they may be busy sowing doubt about climate science in the rest of the populace, they know better. But to know better is not necessarily to desire better. And this thin knowledge, accurate so far as the information goes, does not amount to wisdom. Wisdom, dare we put it mathematically, is information plus transformation, true knowledge wedded to true desire. The great danger of witnessing this perversion is that we might not recognize how much they have already shaped us in our own modes of living and desiring. We cannot possibly hope to contest what holds us secretly in its thrall. In their far-sightedness, Klein and Taylor recognize that what we need is a vision that is every bit as spiritual as it is political. But what that spiritual labor might look like is largely left unspecified. They rightly name the need for new narratives. And they write, we most definitely need a story capable of draining end times fascism of its Gothic power and galvanizing a movement ready to put it all on the line for our collective survival. A story not of end times, but of better times, not of separation and supremacy, but of interdependence and belonging, not of escaping, but staying put and staying faithful to the troubled earthly reality in which we are enmeshed and bound, close quote. That Klein and Taylor should sound the very same notes that Catherine Keller has been sounding for the whole of her career is uncanny and encouraging. Thick, life-giving narratives are certainly in order, but again, the right narratives need to be supplemented with right desiring. We also need the spiritual labor of learning to desire otherwise than these elites, whose power over us is not found only in their donations to the political machine, but also in their control of instrumentalities of attention to which almost all of us are in daily, if not hourly, thrall. Quick, let me check my phone. Social media and our electronic devices, fed by the information we give them, have become as omniscient as the process divine about what we most desire and are only too ready to lure us into and then supply us with our own addictions so that we can speedily proceed toward planetary oblivion as we sit etherized upon our devices. What we need are otherwise practices of desiring, interreligious learning, which together can grant a measure of wise discernment. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm okay? Okay. To begin with, we must call not just for narratives, but a spirituality with teeth. Not a spirituality of the placebo, of complacency, of a peace where there is no peace. The best definition of spirituality of which I am aware comes from perhaps the unlikeliest of suspects, Michel Foucault. You didn't see that coming, did you? In his late lectures, The Hermeneutics of the Subject, he writes, quote, "This is so good. It's so good I want to have it memorized. I'm not quite there yet. We could call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. We will call spirituality, then, the set of these researches, practices, and experience, which may be purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to truth." Isn't that great? That's Foucault. That rocks. Knowledge can be had on the cheap, although even there, among scientists, there must also be patient decades of learning before knowledge emerges. But truth, or wisdom, is another matter. For truth, as savoir, there is a price to be paid for access. Foucault puts it crisply, and again, I must cite him at some length. Quote, "Spirituality postulates that the truth is never given to the subject by right. Spirituality postulates that the subject as such does not have the right of access to the truth and is not capable of having access to the truth. It postulates that the truth is not given to the subject by a simple act of knowledge, connaissance, which could be founded and justified simply by the fact that he is the subject, and because he possesses this or that structure of subjectivity. It postulates for the subject to have right of access to the truth, he must be changed, transformed, shifted, and to become to some extent and up to a certain point other than himself. For truth is only given to the subject at a price that brings the subject's being into play. For as he is, the subject is not capable of truth." Close quote. Friends, that'll preach. Another kind of death I hear in these words, for the subject to become other than and otherwise than himself. Information alone demands no price. Our capitalist elite know all the relevant information. They know the climate science at least as well as everybody in this room. But Foucault notes that it is otherwise with genuine truth. For the latter, the subject must become otherwise because as such, as given, the subject is, quote, "not capable of the truth." It is, of course, this utter refusal of techno-elite subjects to become otherwise than they are that marks elite subjectivity. They would rather the planet go down in flames than pay any price, financial or otherwise, let alone a wholesale reconfiguration of the self itself. Not interested. Foucault's definition of spirituality might well be contested on a variety of grounds. Most especially Christian and other theological traditions might wish to call into question any account of spirituality confined to the work that a subject carries out on himself. Here there remains only effort and little room for grace, for that work that is done in the subject, not without the subject's content, but certainly not by subjective mastery or unmastery alone. Still better to heed Foucault's call for a costly spirituality of becoming otherwise, through purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, etc., even if that call must be supplemented with a longing for what we hope might meet us in, through, and beyond those disciplines, the coming of a grace that exceeds preparation or expectation. I am a theologian after all. Thankfully, the possibility that what we might be met with and so exceeds us remains quite explicit, actually, even if underdeveloped in Foucault's recognition that this work of becoming otherwise than oneself is a labor of desiring. And desiring is never, ever a matter of mere self-mastery. About the transformation and conversion of the subject, Foucault writes, and I quote, "Very roughly, we can say that this conversion may take place in the form of a movement that removes the subject from his current status and condition, either an ascending movement of the subject itself, or else a movement by which the truth comes to him and enlightens him." Again, quite conventionally, let us call this movement in either of its directions the movement of eros. Another major form through which the subject can and must transform himself in order to have access to the truth is a kind of work. This is a work of the self on the self, an elaboration of the self by the self, a progressive transformation of the self by the self for which one takes responsibility in a long labor of ascesis. Eros and ascesis, I think, are the two major forms in Western spirituality for conceptualizing the modalities by which the subject must be transformed in order to finally become capable of truth. This is the second characteristic of spirituality, close quote. That truth might be a matter of visitation, of that which comes to the subject, more than suggests that the self alone is not the master of this process. When, after all, is desiring ever a matter of mastery? Perhaps the disciplines that Foucault rightly names erotics and ascetics are instead to be construed as a willingness to be vulnerable, an exercise of putting oneself in the way of dispossession so that we might be visited from above or merely from the outside, from outside the boundaries of the ego. We dispose ourselves to the possibility of other loves and other solidarities. We render ourselves open to being called out from the incurvatus in se of our species' solipsism. And what comes to us when we dispose ourselves through such spirituality might well be the Holy One herself, or perhaps the tender calling of a forest grove, or a wildness that pulls us into a humility that arises when our feet are placed back upon the living ground of our planetary home. And who's to say that these two are anything but not two? How, at any rate, are we to be met by other loves and deeper solidarities, other than by opening ourselves to counter-disciplines of desiring, that leads us to refuse the disciplining desires that we, perhaps unwittingly, but also often all too knowingly, invite into ourselves by surrendering our will to the instrumentalities of our devices. My iPhone 15 is beginning to feel obsolete to me. I think I need the 16. Here, perhaps, we must speak about another kind of death, an ascesis of refusal to have our hearts colonized by capitalist dreams and desires. The death of the capitalist devouring of planetary resources. That death of death cannot come to pass without a participation other than by way of self-destruction. We will either be devoured by carbon capitalism or we die to it in a kenosis that another feminist eco-theologian, Sally McFaig, urged upon us insistently in her last books. Precisely here, we need a variety of interreligious wisdoms. The Mahayana Buddhist insistence that human liberation requires a focus, not on personal liberation, but a deep commitment to seeking liberation for all sentient beings through the cultivation of an ever more extensive compassion, is desperately needed wisdom in a time of ecological crisis. This insistence on compassion, to be extended even cosmically, was not generated with our present crisis in mind. The animating impulses behind this Mahayana vocation are twofold. The heart-mind, that is, the bodhicitta's true ambit and amplitude, is unconstrained and infinite. To limit its reach is tantamount to self-harm. 2, to seek one's own liberation is a contradiction in terms. When no self exists apart from its relation to all beings whatsoever, there is no private self that could need liberation. Goes for the species too. These classical convictions readily lend themselves to ecological amplification. They also encompass an instructive and indeed indispensable affective logic that demands a hearing. To starve the self of its egoistic affectivity, its craving, aversion, and resulting delusion, the 3 classical poisons of Indic thought, is necessary but insufficient. Against these affective impediments, another mightier one must be mobilized. Negation alone never suffices. An intense longing for the liberation of all sentient beings is the fundamental entry requirement to the bodhisattva path. And the telos of that path is already contained in Nuche, in that very longing. To desire the well-being of all other beings is already to know, at least anticipatorily, that they are not other beings, as they are in no meaningful sense other than you are. To quote Thich Nhat Hanh, all being is interbeing. Wisdom and compassion are thus wholly inseparable, and hence the routine depictions of these two as male and female figures embraced in coitus. The affective and the noetic are inseparable and interdependent. The ecological extension of these insights is so entirely transparent that they hardly need to be spelled out. There is no liberation of the human species apart from the liberation of all our species kin. To seek our own liberation at the expense of theirs is foolhardy and ontologically impossible. There is no human species to be found in isolation from all other species. Moreover, there's no escaping from species narcissism apart from a new and radical affective disposition of compassion for all beings. If the Mahayana vision is to be believed, this all-inclusive and encompassing ecological love does not have to be generated ex nihilo. Keller would remind us that nothing whatsoever is so generated. Rather, such love is inscribed into our own mind-hearts as a species that has no own being apart from its kinship with all other planetary species. What must be amplified is already available. Much more could be and must be said, but let us make a hasty and inconclusive conclusion. There is immense wisdom in discourses that remind us that ours is a time of dying. Learning to die and die well has been a long-standing understanding of the philosophical task since Socrates refused to escape Athens after receiving his death sentence. The legacy continues from Socrates through to the Stoics and Montaigne, and even into our own day in the writing of Bringhurst, Sawicki, and Scranton. Voices worthy of close and careful reading, voices in which there is not a trace of self-pity, fatalism, or recognition. One hears instead a refusal to evade the hard truth that we are rapidly blowing past all planetary constraints, making our current ways of life utterly unsustainable. Hence, a discourse of dying well, given that the terrible loss of many of our siblings is now unavoidable. There is even the hope that a gracious dying that does not amount to planetary immolation might set the stage for the flourishing of our kindred species, whose lives are unwittingly caught up in our consumerist orgy. Recall the apocryphal tale of Luther and his apple tree. The story, surely known to this community, recounts that when Luther was asked what he would do if the world were ending tomorrow, he is purported to have responded, "I would plant an apple tree." Bringhurst hopes that if life is to continue on this earth, it is the wild that will save us. Our solace, as with all passing, will be to behold others whose lives endure long after we ourselves are gone. We must labor to make such survival possible. As for myself, and this vision is one I share with Catherine, I share a refusal of all closure. Instead, I insist on sounding notes of true apocalypse, an unveiling of what truly must die in the hope of what remains yet to be born. We herald the death not of our species, but of what Scranton rightly calls zombie capitalism. This system is, he reminds us, already dead. But like all zombies, voracious nonetheless, and all the more precisely for being dead. That's how zombies work. The labor to which we are called is to hasten that particular death for the sake of a deeper general resurrection. But this death does require our dying well, and our dying as well, a dying within us, to switch metaphors in midstream to metaphors of the demonic, of the spirit of zombie capitalism, which has taken possession of our hearts. That is what needs kenosis, emptying, and a true death for the sake of a deeper and utterly erotic longing for the well-being of all sentient beings. Of this desire, there can be no death. Whom might we become if we learn to desire otherwise? What might become of our planetary commons if such reconfigured and mighty longings were to take root in our hearts, in the hearts of many now living and yet to come? Thanks.
Thank you all so much for these experiences, not just papers. I will not be singing. It is because I love you all, and that's the truth revealed from that. I am sure I will fail at extemporaneously responding to these experiences, but I offer some humble thoughts and then some questions to start our conversation going. First, it seems to me that partly what's happening across these papers is an offering of how to be otherwise through experimenting with different forms. So whether that be through hip hop or song or testimony or acts of care or differently desiring, that we are having to experiment. Once you realize the unveiling of how the scripts and cartographies and identities and scriptures and churches that have been tied up with violence need to also be killed well and not just die well. So then what do we do in that wake seems to be what you are wrestling with, and that you are doing it in experimental ways that is particularly helpful, right, to shake up the space of a conference and the space of activism and the space of religion. But I want to ask, because it seems to me in those experiments you're all walking some thin tightropes. So how do we do responsible post-racism when so easily it could become irresponsible post-racism? How do we live into evangelical holiness when the moral majority has perverted that for exactly climate destruction? How do we keep a love that does not slip to that? How do we work with hospice that does not numb pain, right? All these concepts are fruitful because they are risky. And so I'm hoping we can engage that, engage the fact that violence still exists in national identity, engage the fact that violence still exists in the concept of the kingdom, that it still exists in capitalist ideas of pain management. So how are we checking, how are you all imagining kind of checking those violence, those possibilities of violence? And I know at least for the two Johns, maybe process theology provides something there, but so what is the kind of ways in which, even in our experiments with new names, we can still keep unnaming, recognizing those new violences? The other question I have has to do with love, or thinking about love. There seems to be an emphasis on love explicitly or implicitly across these works. And thinking here about how to ensure that the love we're talking about isn't empire love. So love is sort of an easy term without going, if you don't kind of keep teasing it out. It too easily slips away from us. So, and in thinking about that question of love, I'm thinking not just, we've so well talked about this conference, the when of apocalypse, the where of apocalypse, I think the experimentation of the how of counter-apocalypse. So I still want to keep pushing on the with whom. With whom are we aligning ourselves in the experimental counter-apocalypse? I think of Donna Haraway saying that you have to have throw in your lot with some ways of life and not others. There's always a cut that you have to be responsible to. I've been thinking about Sophie Lewis's work in Abolish the Family, where she talks about that even kin contains hierarchies of kind and violence, and she offers instead kith, of how do we do community through shared ground, history, desire, and concern. So I'm wondering here, could we become a kith politicus or even a kith erotic over a homo economicus or a raced man? Are there other sort of ways in which we might align ourselves? Including, with whom do we swarm, invoking our dear departed friend, Bill Connolly? With whom will we be in the counter-apocalypse? And in thinking with that and thinking with all of your work, I was drawn back to Carol Wainwright's work on the polyamorous bastard from James Baldwin as construction of an African-American religious naturalism. And I wanted to quote some of what she says of Baldwin, because I think there's resonances across that might help us come together. And so she writes, "This intimate encounter of knowing and being known by another brings with it a new awareness of seeing others differently and experiencing one's humanity as both free and bound. As Baldwin stated, an individual is both stronger and more vulnerable, both free and bound." And this is Baldwin now. "Free, paradoxically, because now you have a home, your lover's arms, and bound to that mystery, precisely a bondage which liberates you into something of the glory and suffering of the world." So then White continues, "The embodied love Baldwin evoked also imbued traditional religious terms with new, fresh, expanded meanings. His radical view of love was something active, more like a fire, like a wind, not an empty abstraction describing a passive stance before some authorial figure outside of oneself. Here we see Baldwin rejecting the traditional otherworldly eschatological discourse of fear and damnation featured in holiness traditions and replacing it with an emphasis on the concrete dynamics of living here and now." And then later White says, "In Baldwin's nomenclature of desire, he became a freak. Here, a key insight of his analysis is that freaks represent an epistemic marker that conjoins race, gender, and sexuality in US culture. Freaks are deviant individuals who do not conform to the ideal standards of sexuality and normative configurations of masculine identity with a racist, homophobic culture." Baldwin observed, "Freaks are called freaks, and they are treated as they are treated in the main abominably, because they are human beings who cause to echo deep within us our most profound terrors and desires." And then White continues, "Accordingly, freaks uncloak a horrific and terrifying truth about purportedly normal people, providing insight into the dangers, violence, and weaknesses endemic to the American ideal of masculinity. As such, freaks remain outliers, sharing with bastards an illegitimacy that keeps the cultural myth intact." And so I'm wondering, as I'm asking you all about love and about with whom, is there a way that we can stay with the bastards, with the gods of the back alleys, to get our freak on more than put on our robes of glory? So how do you make choices in the constructions of counter-apocalypse, and how might that matter? I want to read one more kind of long quote, but I also think it really touches on what we've all been doing here and what you all have offered to me, and then I will get into the concrete questions. So this is from Saadia Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And at the end, she's talking about the young black women in the choir, the chorus of the dance halls that go unnamed. And she says, "Who else would dare believe another world was possible? Spend the good days readying for it and the bad days shedding tears that it has not yet arrived. Who else would be reckless enough to dream a colored girl's or a black woman's future? Devote even an afternoon musing about the history of the universe seen from nowhere? Or could be convinced that nothing could be said about the Negro problem, modernity, global capitalism, police brutality, state killings, and the Anthropocene if it did not take her into account, did not reckon with the disavowed geography of the world, the barracoon, the hold, the plantation, the camp, the reservation, the garret, the colony, the attic studio, the bedroom, the urban archipelagos, the ghetto, and the prison. The chorus bears all of it for us. The Greek etymology of the word chorus refers to dance within an enclosure. What better articulates the long history of struggle, the ceaseless practice of black radicalism and refusal, the tumult and upheaval of open rebellion, than the acts of collaboration and improvisation that unfold within the space of enclosure? The chorus is the vehicle for another kind of story, not of the great man or the tragic hero, but one in which all modalities play a part, where the headless group incites change, where mutual aid provides the resource for collective action, not leader in mass, where the untranslatable songs and seeming nonsense make good the promise of revolution. The chorus propels transformation. It is an incubator of possibility, an assembly sustaining dreams of the otherwise. Somewhere down the line, the numbers increase, the tribe increases, the chorus increases. So how do you keep on? She can't help it. The struggle is eternal, somebody else carries on. So with that, I want to ask where you see the chorus, where are the experiments? How do you differentiate love from empire love? How do you incorporate undoings, unnamings, even with your own proposals? And then because I think enclosure and also your projects bring to mind home, and we've talked about home. So what is home in the counter-apocalypse?
Thank you for the gift of those wonderful questions. They signify deep listening, but also an intuition that greater clarity and specificity is required, which is just the point of TTC. The gift of being able to offer papers that are not fully cooked and then go back to labor on them. But in terms of just building on what I've tried to do, I think I'm suggesting the possibility of, and this is dim in the paper perhaps, but could be made more explicit, that at least the kind of communities we need to combat this are communities that are deeply interreligious in terms of how they learn from, with, and labor alongside each other. So in terms of with who, my implicit, if not explicit, answer there is that we are not about to face these crises if we don't school ourselves in communities that have talked forever about deeper and far more extensive loves than species love. I don't know that Buddhists would have, Shantideva or any of these folks would have imagined that their work has ecological ramifications, but literally the practice of the Bodhisattva way in its loving kindness and compassion forms is to, in disciplined practice, to extend our affection beyond the range of the planet even, to all sentient beings anywhere, because in Buddhist cosmologies, this is not the only universe there is. And the point of insisting that in principle we practice to render our loves cosmic, not just planetary, is that their crazy claim is that's the true amplitude of the human heart. Right? To love in any less or arrested fashion is self-harm, as I said. So if you take that seriously, it means at least other planetary kith, right? It means at least that. So it's a form of imagination and discipline and practice and extension of love that most Christians have not even begun to dream, right? So I don't think it's the solution to all that there has to be done, but at least that's there as a kind of discipline that we need to learn from those who've practiced for millennia in extending their love well beyond the species border.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, Karen, and thank you to all the panelists for really, really good papers. I think that the way I approach this, and I didn't do that in this work, as I was kind of just hanging out, trying to, but the way this is spelled out in terms of how one might be cautious to ensure responsible post-race and responsible nationality occurs. There are kind of four parts to how I put this together in the book. I only said two because I forgot to say the other two. The first is kind of this creativity, reimagining beyond the categories that have been put on us. That's the first. And the second one is the useful lived abstract. And the third is the dissolution, which I refer to in the text as the dissing of the solution. So after one says, okay, well, the society has referred to me as black, I can get beyond that. But after I may say, well, my ancestry comes from this particular region of the world that has this particular flag, I'm this. Now I have to deconstruct that. And so the fourth stage is repetition, which is, because I talk about how Whitehead says, well, there's certain things that are useful lived abstractions. Masumi puts the lived part on it. I kind of argue that because of the way that the category of race is set up, it by definition can only be hierarchical. So, but that doesn't mean that other categories, even though they're not, like nationality, don't have to be dissoluted as well. Because, and even the way I kind of describe nationality, there are two definitions I kind of play with. The first one is more so the nationality of hegemony. Well, the particular nation says we're this. And that has happened in certain parts of the region that are now referred to as Latin America, has not been successful. But there is something else that I call organic nationality, which is these sorts of not intersections like, okay, well, different things coming together, but inner sections, which the term intersection does not presuppose that, well, this pen is different than this table, or this particular person is different from that particular person. Intersection is more organic nationality, and I use Belize as a faulty example of that, is that, well, there's something that also happens where people in relation are experiencing something that cannot be described by state-sanctioned nationality. So I think, to your point, that those are sorts of the safeguards, which the safeguard is that there is no safeguard, that this is a perpetual revision of identity.
Well, these 2 days have been so rich, and the papers, and so creative. My brain hurts. I don't know about the rest of you. So I don't know if what I'm going to say is in any way intelligible. Thinking right now, my paper, obviously, as I called it, was apocalyptic testimony of a Jesus pietist. That's not how I'm talking about when I'm doing my regular work, right now, with my Substack Climate Hope Together. my audience is the climate movement writ large. And so that includes everybody. That includes every faith tradition, no faith tradition. You know, we need everybody. You know, we can't be just like, oh, I'm going to focus on my little group. Obviously, I am not hiding who I am, but at the same time, my language and how I'm talking about it, I'm talking about values that I say here. These are, I think, are the values that we in the climate movement hold together. Now, you talk about love. Love in the context of, for me, I talk about it with that we have 10 movement values, and that love, which I say is the L word, because a lot of folks in the climate policy arena, boy, they will never reference, mention the word love. It's all serious, kind of, this and that. And it doesn't, those kinds of conversations don't get into like, why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? But I say, our most important movement value is love, because it empowers all the other values. But one could say, Jim, that's great. We can all love hard. We can love, and we can just, oh man, we really love. But do we have hope? Do we have, even with all our love, are we going to, deal with this problem of climate change in the end, right? So we can have love, but it doesn't mean that we're going to, that our hope is a hope that's grounded in reality. So I deal in very practical kinds of things. Can we get this done? Can we get these folks to do this? In other words, again, as I said, I'm a transformationalist, so I'm all about, hey, how can we be making the change that we need to make? And so back in 2019, there were some polls out, and this is right when we're having, the beginning of the presidential primaries. And there were some polls out where Democrats said that, some of the polls said that their top issue for Democrats was climate change. And then others, it was in the top 3. And so what happens? Biden had put out a pretty good plan on climate. After these polls came out, everybody else was tripping over themselves to put out a better plan, a bigger plan, a more stupendous plan. Biden comes out with an even better plan after that. And they're working with the Sunrise, people in the Sunrise movement, these climate organizations that didn't exist essentially 5 years ago, and from 2019. So are we just screwed? Or, I mean, is it like, we're whistling past the graveyard with our love, with my Jesus piety? We're just whistling past the climate graveyard? Or can we actually change things? Well, I actually think we can change things. And I think what I offer folks is realistic hope, grounded in the reality that we can, in fact, create change. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the social scientist work Erica Chenoweth. And they postulate, they demonstrate through historical examples that 3.5% of a population can, in fact, of a social change group, 3.5% of a population can affect profound change in a society. It doesn't always happen. But when we start to think that we have to have just like every frickin' body, or we're not gonna make it, that's just not true. Now again, we get 3.5% in the climate movement. We're all gonna win? It's all gonna be great? no. It gives us a chance. We have a chance. And so I'm about ideas that help to bring about action. And so if somehow the idea is not leading to action, I start to lose interest in it really quickly. So that's what I'm trying to help my audience, the climate movement writ large, understand, that we can affect change, we can make a difference, and for each of us, it is who and what we love that is the ground of that action and really the source of our hope.
Okay, we're unfortunately at time. I've been given the signal to stop it, yes.
But please don't stop thinking and talking about it. We have one more session tomorrow morning at 10. And you've done all the work. You've heard all the papers. You've done all the thinking. Relax a little bit tonight. Let it percolate. Let it steep. And please, 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 please be back tomorrow, as we're going to spend the entire 2-hour block tomorrow making it full colloquy, where it's going to be discussion amongst us all. Thinking about what you've learned, thinking about what we do next, thinking about what's working for you, thinking about what's not. So please think about that for tomorrow morning at 10. Let me ask again, one more time, please, please, please say thank you to our 2 great chapel techs. And I want you to realize they worked late Friday night and all day Saturday, and there are only 3 more weekends left before commencement. So I want you to understand what they put in for us today to make this work, and don't just clap for them. Tell them thank you on your way out. Thank you as well to those who've been helping us with logistics for the panel, to set everything up so that we have the car services back and forth, so we got your travel in, so that we've got your food arranged. We've all still got a date tonight. And 8 o'clock tonight, the puck drops for the Penguins versus the Flyers in Game 1 of Round 1 of the Stanley Cup. Have a good thought for Philly. Other than that, let's break for today, and I'll see you in the morning with some good ideas and conversation. Thank you.